Tonight we begin with a quiet but unsettling thought. What if the governments you recognize today are not as young as they appear? What if beneath parliaments, congresses, and ministries lies something far older, something deliberately forgotten, yet still breathing softly beneath the surface of modern power? So, before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. And as you settle in, I invite you to share your local location and the time you are listening from, wherever you may be in the world tonight. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. You imagine yourself standing at night, looking at a city skyline, glowing with electric certainty. Everything feels solid, regulated, final, yet a whisper slips in. What if this order is only the latest layer? What if, beneath the visible structures of law and leadership, older blueprints still guide the flow of power? The thought is shocking, but not loud. It arrives slowly, like fog. You are told that nations were born from revolutions, declarations, heroic moments carved into stone. But what if those moments were not beginnings at all? What if they were transitions? You begin to notice how often governments speak of institutions, of foundations, of pillars. Why these words? Why not inventions or creations? Could it be that something already stood there before the banners were raised? As you drift deeper, the name Tartaria begins to surface, not shouted, not proven, just murmured. A civilization said to have stretched across vast lands, appearing on old maps, then fading away as if erased with careful intent. You are not asked to believe this fully, only to sit with it. If such a civilization existed, could its systems of governance have truly vanished overnight? Or would they adapt, rename themselves, soften their edges, and continue quietly? You think of how power behaves. It dislikes chaos. It prefers continuity. When empires fall, do the rulers truly disappear? Or do they simply step back, change clothes, rewrite titles? You imagine clerks saving documents while cities burn, administrators preserving methods while flags are replaced. History celebrates collapse, but bureaucracy survives in silence. The rhythm of this idea is slow, almost soothing. Governments today feel complex, layered, strangely impersonal. You vote, you pay taxes, you follow laws written in language that feels ancient even when newly printed. Why does authority always sound old? Why does it borrow gravity from the past? Perhaps because age itself commands obedience. As your breathing slows, you sense that this story is not about proving anything. It is about noticing patterns, about allowing the possibility that modern governments may be echoes, not origins, that behind polished speeches and democratic rituals, there may linger an inherited structure, older than memory, guiding outcomes while remaining unseen. You are not afraid. The thought is strangely calming. If power is ancient, then humanity has always lived with it, negotiated with it, slept beneath it. And tonight, as you rest, you simply allow yourself to wonder what else might be hidden in plain sight. You move forward without noticing a clear boundary, as if the thought from before simply stretches and reshapes itself. The name returns again, slower this time, heavier, Tartaria. It does not arrive like a revelation, but like a memory you are not sure belongs to you. A forgotten colossus, some call it. Not a single city, not a lone kingdom, but something vast enough to feel unreal by modern standards. You imagine opening an old book, its pages thick and yellowed, smelling faintly of dust and time. Across its maps spreads a name that no longer appears in classrooms or atlases. Tartaria, written calmly, confidently, covering enormous stretches of land. No dramatic explanation accompanies it. No warning, just a quiet certainty that this place existed, that it was known, that it required no justification at the time. And you begin to wonder, how does something so large disappear? Empires you have learned about fell with noise. Rome collapsed in fire and betrayal. The Mongols thundered across continents and then fractured. But Tartaria, in these whispered stories, seems to dissolve. No final battle, No famous last emperor, just a gradual fading, like a dream slipping away when morning light enters the room. Is that not strange, or is it deliberate? You are not told that Tartaria was perfect, not golden, not divine, only that it was organized, structured, vastly administered, a civilization that may have understood governance not as domination, but as maintenance, roads, cities, laws, standards, the kind of systems that do not vanish easily, because too many people depend on them. As you picture it, Tartaria feels less like a myth and more like an infrastructure, and infrastructures, once built, tend to outlive the names of their builders. You begin to sense that perhaps Tartaria did not collapse, but transformed, like a river redirected underground, still flowing, still shaping the land above it in subtle ways. You think of how history is written. Victors write loudly, losers fade quietly. But what about those who neither lost nor won, only stepped aside? What if Tartaria's disappearance was not a defeat, but a strategic withdrawal from visibility? A decision to let the age of flags and nations rise, while older systems continued beneath, unchallenged because they were unseen. Your thoughts slow, as if guided by a patient hand. You consider how modern governments rely on inherited borders, inherited cities, inherited trade routes. How many capitals stand on foundations far older than the nations they claim to represent? How often do we rename instead of rebuild? Replace symbols, not structures? The idea settles in gently. Perhaps Tartaria was not erased by accident. Perhaps it was inconvenient, too unified for a world that would soon be divided, too centralized for an era that required fragmentation in order to control populations more efficiently. Smaller nations are easier to manage. Conflicting identities keep attention occupied. You are reminded of how children's stories are simplified before bedtime. Complicated truths are softened, trimmed, made digestible. History, too, may be told this way. What if Tartaria was removed from the story not because it was false, but because it was too big, too confusing, too threatening to the new narrative of modern governance? As your breathing deepens, you imagine scholars debating behind closed doors, cartographers revising maps, printers instructed to update names. A slow, administrative erasure, not destruction, but editing, the most effective kind. After all, what is forgotten does not need to be guarded. You feel no urgency to decide what is real. That is not required tonight. Instead, you simply observe how the idea of Tartaria challenges the way you see time. It suggests continuity where you were taught separation. It hints that modern governments may be chapters, not books, pages torn from a much longer manuscript. And if Tartaria truly was a forgotten colossus, then its influence would not announce itself. It would whisper, in procedures, in layouts of cities, in the very concept of centralized authority presented as normal, inevitable, timeless. You grow calmer with this thought. There is comfort in imagining that humanity has navigated complex systems before, that today's structures are not experiments, but inheritances. Even if the name Tartaria feels uncertain, the pattern feels familiar, something old guiding something new. As you rest with this idea, you realize that forgetting does not always mean loss. Sometimes it means transformation. And as the name Tartaria fades once more into the background, you sense that its shadow may still stretch quietly across the modern world, patient, unseen, waiting for curious minds to notice the shape it leaves behind. You drift onward, and the next layer reveals itself, not through stories, but through drawings, lines on paper, inked coastlines, names written by hands long gone. You imagine yourself leaning over a wooden table lit by candlelight, studying maps that were never meant to survive into your time. And yet, somehow, they did. Maps that should not exist. You notice first how calm they are. No question marks, no speculation. Vast regions labelled with confidence, as if the cartographer had no doubt at all. Tartaria appears again, sprawling across continents, its borders soft but unmistakable, not marked as wilderness, not marked as unknown. Simply there, and you feel a quiet unease. Because maps, above all things, are instruments of power. They are not fantasies. They are tools. You ask yourself gently, why would mapmakers invent something so large, so specific, only to have it vanish later? Mistakes happen, yes, but repeated mistakes, across centuries, across different nations, different languages, that seems less like error and more like omission. And omission, you sense, is rarely accidental. You trace the ink with your finger in your imagination. These maps predate satellites, airplanes, global surveys, and yet they display an understanding of geography that feels surprisingly mature. Rivers flow accurately, mountain ranges curve with intention, trade routes are implied, if not explicitly drawn. Whoever made these maps believed they were documenting a known world, not guessing at it. And here comes the quiet question that keeps you awake just a little longer. If Tartaria did not exist, then what exactly were these cartographers mapping? You think about how governments today guard geographic data carefully. Borders define taxation, law, identity, war. To draw a map is to claim authority. So when old maps label Tartaria without explanation, it suggests recognition, a shared understanding among elites, something agreed upon, standardized, accepted. Yet, later maps tell a different story. Slowly, subtly, the name recedes. It is replaced by smaller regions, fragmented labels, new political entities. Not overnight, not dramatically, just enough that future generations would never notice what was missing. Like editing a sentence by removing one word at a time. You realize how soothing this process is. No alarms, no revolutions, just revision. Your thoughts wander to modern classrooms. How maps are presented as neutral, factual, settled. But every map is a choice. What to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize, what to erase. And suddenly, you see that history may not be rewritten through lies, but through updates. You imagine a scholar centuries ago, instructed to redraw the world. No violence required, just new funding, new standards, new curricula. Over time, the old maps become curiosities, then relics, then embarrassments, stored away, labeled outdated, eventually forgotten, and you wonder, forgotten by whom? Because power does not forget what benefits it. Power archives. It stores. It remembers selectively. So perhaps these maps were not lost, but retired, removed from public consciousness while remaining accessible to those who needed the long view. You think of how modern governments rely on precedent, legal precedent, historical precedent, territorial precedent. Where do these precedents originate, if not from earlier systems of administration? If Tartaria once coordinated vast lands, then its maps would have been essential, and even if the name disappeared, the knowledge would remain useful. The idea settles into you like a lullaby, gentle, repetitive. Maps appear, maps disappear, borders shift, names change, but land remains, and whoever understands the land controls the future built upon it. You notice another detail. Many old maps include Tartaria without dramatic illustration. No monsters, no warnings, no mythical embellishments. It is not placed alongside dragons or sea serpents. It sits comfortably among known territories. This suggests something ordinary, not legendary. A place familiar enough to require no explanation. And yet, today, even mentioning Tartaria invites skepticism, dismissal, laughter. How curious. Something once mundane has become absurd. That transformation alone tells a story. You breathe more slowly now, letting the thoughts soften. This is not about proving Tartaria's existence beyond doubt. It is about noticing how reality can be shaped by repetition and silence. If a name is removed often enough, it begins to feel unreal. If a concept is excluded long enough, it becomes unthinkable. You consider how modern governments depend on citizens accepting the present as the only possible outcome. Nations feel inevitable, borders feel permanent, authority feels natural. But maps remind you that all of this is temporary. Drawn lines can be redrawn, names can be replaced, memory can be guided. And perhaps that is the hidden lesson of these maps. Not that Tartaria ruled everything, but that something once unified has been intentionally fragmented. That modern governments may be inheritors of a broken map, encouraged to forget the original whole. As your thoughts grow heavier, you imagine those old cartographers again, calmly working, confident, unaware that their work would one day be questioned, dismissed, or quietly sidelined. They were not writing myths, they were recording what they believed to be true. And now, centuries later, you sit with their work, feeling the strange comfort of uncertainty. Not knowing becomes part of the journey. Wonder replaces certainty. Curiosity replaces belief. You let the image of those maps fade gently, like ink dissolving into water. And as it does, one idea lingers, slow and steady. If maps can change without anyone noticing, what else might have been redrawn while humanity slept? You do not feel a sharp turn as the story moves on. Instead, it feels like a deepening, as if the same thought has sunk lower, reaching something heavier. The idea of disappearance now becomes something else entirely, not vanishing, but resetting. Quietly, efficiently, you begin to sense a pattern that repeats across time. Civilizations rise, structures form, authority settles in, and then, at certain moments, everything seems to begin again. New calendars, new flags, new constitutions. History calls these moments revolutions, collapses, renaissances. But you wonder, are they really endings? Or are they reorganizations? You imagine standing in a city after a great upheaval. Smoke still hangs in the air. Statues have fallen. Names of streets are being changed. And yet, behind the scenes, someone is still collecting records. Someone is still managing supply chains. Someone still understands how things work, because daily life cannot pause for ideology. This is where the idea of silent resets enters. Softly, without accusation. Not dramatic overthrows, but administrative continuities. You think of how often new governments inherit the buildings, the laws, the debts, the systems of their predecessors. They condemn the old order in speeches, yet rely on its machinery to function. And you ask yourself gently, who teaches the new rulers how to rule? If Tartaria was once a vast administrative civilization, then its true strength may not have been armies, but systems. Systems survive rulers. Systems outlast beliefs. They can be paused, renamed, fragmented, but rarely destroyed completely, especially when populations depend on them for stability. You imagine scribes, accountants, planners, engineers, people whose loyalty is not to flags, but to order itself. When one regime falls, they simply update the letterhead. The work continues. This thought is not frightening. It is strangely comforting. Chaos, after all, is rarely tolerated for long. History textbooks often dramatize transitions. Kings fall, republics rise, empires collapse. But lived reality is quieter. Bread must still be baked. Water must still flow, borders must still be managed, and someone always knows how to do these things, even when the symbols above them change. You think of how often modern governments declare themselves new eras, new beginnings, and yet they immediately reference old precedents, old rights, old traditions. Why lean backward if everything truly began fresh? Perhaps because starting from nothing is impossible. Perhaps because every reset is built atop something older. The notion of Tartaria fits gently into this pattern, not as a single dramatic fall, but as a gradual absorption into a new, global narrative. A civilization too centralized, too encompassing, quietly dissolved into smaller units, each unit believing itself sovereign, while still operating within inherited frameworks. You begin to notice how often power resets coincide with disasters. Fires, plagues, wars, events that conveniently destroy records while justifying reorganization. Not conspiracies shouted aloud, but opportunities recognized by those who think in centuries, not lifetimes. And again, you are not asked to believe in intention, only to notice convenience. Your breathing slows as the idea unfolds. A silent reset does not announce itself. It feels like relief. The chaos ends. Order returns. people are grateful. They do not ask too many questions about who designed the new order, because it feels familiar, functional, inevitable. You imagine generations growing up inside such resets, unaware that what they call tradition is actually a preserved fragment, a shard of something larger. Modern governments, then, may be mosaics, pieces rearranged after each collapse, creating the illusion of novelty while maintaining continuity. The lullaby rhythm returns. Rise, fall, reset, rise again. Each time, the story is simplified. The past becomes shorter. Complex histories are flattened into timelines that fit into textbooks and speeches, and anything that does not fit is quietly left out. You feel a strange calm accepting this possibility. It suggests that humanity is not as lost as it sometimes seems. That knowledge is not entirely erased, only hidden, condensed, protected from the chaos of mass memory. Perhaps this is how civilization survives at all. As your thoughts grow heavier, you picture a great clock, not ticking loudly, but adjusting itself after each disruption. Time continues. Power continues. Names change, but the mechanism remains. And as you drift closer to sleep, one soft question lingers, like a final note held in the air. If modern governments are the result of silent resets, then how many times has the world already ended? Without anyone ever noticing, you move gently onward, and the world around you begins to take shape not as stories or maps, but as stone and brick. You are walking now, slowly, through grand avenues and silent halls. Architecture rises around you, heavy with intention, and you realize that buildings, unlike words, are difficult to erase. You stand before structures that feel older than the nations that claim them. Courthouses, parliaments, capitals, cathedrals repurposed into state buildings. They carry a gravity that modern glass towers rarely possess. High ceilings, perfect symmetry, columns that echo civilizations long gone. And you ask yourself, quietly, why does power always move into buildings that already feel powerful? You are told these structures were built to inspire awe, to represent strength, order, permanence, but many of them appear suddenly in historical records, fully formed, technically advanced, and remarkably uniform across different regions. You notice how similar government buildings look across continents, as if following an inherited template rather than local invention. You imagine a civilization that understood architecture as memory, not just shelter, but instruction. Buildings that teach obedience through scale, that calm unrest through proportion, that whisper. Without words, this order existed before you, and it will exist after you. If Tartaria was such a civilization, then its architecture may have been its most enduring language. Stone does not argue, it waits. You walk through these spaces in your mind, marble floors worn smooth by footsteps that history does not name, staircases built for crowds, not individuals, windows positioned not for beauty alone, but for light control, surveillance, ritual timing. These are not the choices of a hurried revolutionary society. They suggest planning across generations. And then you notice something else. Many of these buildings are said to have been constructed during periods of limited technology. No cranes, no power tools, no modern logistics, yet they rise with precision that challenges explanation. History assures you it was done through hard labor and ingenuity, and perhaps it was, but the scale still feels inherited. You think of how new governments often move into old palaces, how revolutions rarely demolish the halls of power. They occupy them, they repaint them, they rename them, but they keep them, because authority feels more legitimate when it is housed in something that already feels ancient. This is where architecture becomes political memory, not a record of who built it, but of how it makes you feel. Small, quiet, respectful, willing. Modern governments benefit from this emotional inheritance without having to explain its origin. You imagine Tartarian builders designing not for one regime, but for continuity itself. Structures meant to outlast ideology. Spaces flexible enough to host kings, councils, parliaments, committees, without changing their fundamental message. Order is here. Your thoughts soften as you accept this possibility. That architecture carries forward intentions even when names are lost. That modern governments may not fully understand the psychological tools they inherited, only that they work. You notice how many old buildings are now labeled as restored, renovated, repurposed. Rarely do we ask restored from what, repurposed from whose vision. Those questions feel unnecessary, even impolite. The building stands. That is enough. And as you slow your walk, you feel a gentle realization settle in. Perhaps Tartaria's greatest influence was not in laws or rulers, but in space itself, in how power is staged, in how humans are guided by ceilings and corridors, by echo and light. You grow calm, imagining that you are not alone in these spaces. Generations before you walked here too, under different flags, believing different stories, yet feeling the same quiet weight. The building does not care who governs. It only preserves the structure of governance. As your steps fade, the stone remains, patient, unquestioning, still shaping behavior long after its creators are forgotten. And before the image dissolves, one final thought drifts through you, slow and gentle. If architecture remembers what people forget, then how much of modern authority is simply borrowed memory, standing silently around us every day? You do not leave the buildings behind. Instead, you sink beneath them, into the quieter layers where words are written, copied, and enforced. The stone above you holds power, but here, in ink and parchment, power becomes precise. This is where rules live. This is where order is taught to repeat itself. You imagine shelves lined with old volumes, their spines cracked, titles faded, law codes, charters, statutes. They feel ancient even when printed recently. Their language is slow, ceremonial, deliberate, and you notice how little it changes. Centuries pass, yet the tone remains the same. Why does law always sound as though it is remembering something? You are told that modern legal systems were born from enlightenment, from reason, from progress. But when you read the words themselves, they feel older than that. They speak of duties, obligations, jurisdictions, precedents, concepts that do not belong to youthful societies discovering themselves, but to mature systems refining long-established order. And so you wonder, what if modern law is not an invention, but an echo? If Tartaria was a civilization of vast scale, it would have required sophisticated legal frameworks to manage diversity, distance, and continuity. Such frameworks would not disappear easily. They would be too useful. Instead, they would be absorbed, localized, translated, and preserved under new authorities. You picture scribes copying old laws, adjusting names, changing references, but keeping structure intact. A river reshaped into canals, each feeding a smaller field, yet all originating from the same source. Modern nations may believe they crafted their legal identities independently, while unknowingly inheriting fragments of a much older code. Your thoughts slow as you notice how law resists emotion. Revolutions rage, but contracts endure. Governments fall, but property rights persist. Even the most radical upheavals preserve legal continuity where possible. Why? Because law is the skeleton of civilization. Remove it entirely, and the body collapses. You think of how many legal principles feel universal, innocent until proven guilty. The sanctity of agreements, the hierarchy of courts. These ideas appear across cultures and eras. Are they simply human instincts, or signs of a shared administrative ancestry? You are not told that Tartarian law was just or unjust, only that it may have existed at a scale requiring abstraction, standardization, and delegation. Exactly the qualities modern governments rely on. Exactly the qualities that feel too heavy to have been invented overnight. The lullaby rhythm deepens. You imagine judges wearing robes that resemble ancient garments, ceremonies that feel theatrical, ritualistic, almost religious. Law is performed, not just applied. Why? Perhaps because ritual reinforces memory. It reminds participants that they are stepping into something older than themselves. You realize that even the concept of the state feels ancient, an invisible entity with rights, responsibilities, and continuity beyond individual lives. This idea does not arise naturally. It must be taught, maintained, inherited. Could Tartaria have been one of the first to formalize such an abstraction? Your breathing grows slower as you consider how legal language often resists simplification. Complexity protects continuity. Those who do not understand the law rely on those who do, and those who do understand it often trace their knowledge through long chains of apprenticeship and tradition. Perhaps this is how Tartarian influence survived, not through conquest, but through curriculum, through training those who would later govern under different names, different flags, while using familiar frameworks. You feel no urge to accuse. The idea feels neutral, almost compassionate. Civilizations borrow from one another. They build on what works, and what works best is rarely discarded, only rebranded. As you drift closer to sleep, you imagine a courtroom empty at night, benches silent, papers stacked neatly. The law remains, even when no one is present, waiting, patient, ready to be invoked again tomorrow, just as it was invoked centuries ago. And in that quiet space, one final question rests gently beside you. If laws remember what people forget, then whose memory is modern justice truly carrying forward? You move onward without effort, as if the path is unfolding beneath your feet. From laws written in careful language, your attention drifts to symbols, small, silent shapes that carry enormous weight. Flags, seals, crests, emblems pressed into wax, carved into stone, stamped onto documents. You have seen them all your life, yet tonight, you look at them differently. You notice how governments speak through symbols more often than words. An eagle, a double-headed bird, a sunburst, a crown floating above a shield. These images feel timeless, almost detached from the nations that display them. And you ask yourself softly, why do modern states rely on symbols that feel far older than their constitutions? Symbols do not explain themselves. They bypass logic and speak directly to memory, even to instinct. They feel inherited, not designed, and that is what makes them powerful. You begin to sense that symbols are not chosen casually. They are selected because they already carry authority. If Tartaria was a civilization of scale and continuity, then it would have needed a shared symbolic language images that could be recognized across vast distances, across cultures and dialects. Symbols that could unify without explanation. Symbols that survived even when words failed. You imagine such emblems passing quietly from one regime to another, slightly altered, simplified, reframed. A wing becomes an eagle. A radiant disk becomes a star. A crown loses its jewels but keeps its shape. Over time, the origin fades, but the emotional effect remains. You think of how often governments insist their symbols represent freedom, unity, progress, and yet the designs themselves rarely feel modern. They feel ceremonial, hierarchical, rooted in ideas of order, guardianship, and control. Perhaps that is because these symbols were never meant to express novelty, but continuity. Your thoughts slow as you recall seeing the same motifs appear in distant, unrelated places. Similar seals on old buildings, familiar shapes etched into ancient ruins, patterns repeating across continents as if copied from a forgotten template. Coincidence, perhaps, or inheritance. You are not asked to believe that Tartaria's symbols were deliberately passed down, only to consider that when power changes hands, it often keeps the visual language that works, because symbols, once accepted, are difficult to replace. People trust what feels familiar, even if they do not know why. You feel a strange comfort in this. Symbols act like anchors in time. They stabilize authority by suggesting that it has always existed, that it belongs to something larger than any individual government. Modern states benefit from this illusion of permanence, whether or not they understand its origins. You imagine a document being signed centuries ago, sealed with a mark that still echoes in modern insignia. The people involved are long gone, but the symbol remains, unchanged, still commanding respect. It is almost alive in its persistence. As your breathing deepens, you realize that symbols are perhaps the quietest carriers of history. They do not argue, they do not explain, they simply appear, again and again, asking to be accepted. And as the images begin to blur and soften, one gentle thought drifts through your mind, slow and steady. If symbols outlive governments, then whose authority are we really recognizing when we salute a flag or trust a seal? You continue without resistance, as though the story itself is carrying you now. The symbols fade into the background, and something quieter takes their place. Not rulers, not flags, but people who are rarely seen, the ones who remain when everything else changes. You begin to sense them as a presence rather than a group. Administrators, record keepers, planners, the invisible hands that make systems function. They do not appear in heroic portraits or dramatic histories, yet nothing works without them. And you wonder, calmly, who truly governs when governments fall. You imagine an empire in its final days. Leaders argue, crowds gather, ideologies clash, but somewhere away from the noise, clerks are still filing documents, engineers still maintain water systems, accountants still track resources, because order must continue, even as power shifts. This is where the idea of a surviving bureaucracy settles gently into your thoughts, not as a conspiracy, but as a necessity. Systems do not erase themselves. They are carried forward by people trained to preserve function above loyalty. If Tartaria was a civilization built on administration rather than spectacle, then its greatest legacy would not be monuments, but method. Procedures that could be taught, replicated, and adapted. A way of governing that did not depend on who sat on the throne, but on how information flowed. You imagine these administrators living through transitions, offering their expertise to new rulers who needed stability. Their language changes, their uniforms change, but their knowledge remains. Over time, their origins are forgotten, even by themselves. They simply become how things are done. Your thoughts grow slower as you notice how modern governments rely heavily on permanent institutions, civil services, departments, agencies. They persist regardless of elections or revolutions. Leaders come and go, but the machinery hums quietly underneath. Is this not strange? The visible face of power is temporary, yet the invisible body is permanent. You consider how training in governance often follows long traditions. Schools, manuals, protocols, passed down quietly, refined rather than reinvented. Perhaps Tartarian administrators once developed systems so efficient that abandoning them would have been unthinkable. You are not told these bureaucrats were benevolent or cruel, only that they were consistent, and consistency is the true currency of authority. As your breathing slows, you imagine an unbroken chain of instruction stretching across centuries, not recorded in dramatic histories, but embedded in routine. File this here, report that there, approve this form, deny that request. Order emerges not from vision, but from repetition. You begin to feel how comforting bureaucracy can be. Predictable, stable, almost soothing. It removes uncertainty by replacing it with process, and perhaps that is why it survives every collapse. People crave structure, especially after chaos. You imagine Tartaria dissolving not into ruin, but into departments. Its centralized order, fragmented into manageable pieces, each absorbed by emerging states. Over time, no one remembers the source, only the function. As your thoughts soften, you sense that modern governance may not be as fragmented as it appears. Beneath different languages and laws, similar procedures echo, similar hierarchies, similar flows of authority. As if all are variations on a forgotten original, you feel no fear in this realization, only a quiet acceptance. Systems endure because humanity needs them, and perhaps Tartaria was simply an early expression of something universal, something we keep rediscovering because it works. As you drift closer to sleep, one final question rests gently in your mind, like a file left open on a desk. If bureaucracy survives every empire, then where does power truly reside? In the ruler, or in the system that remains when the ruler is gone? You glide onward, and the world becomes quieter still, as if even the paperwork has fallen asleep. Beneath laws, symbols, and administrators, something hums softly, invisible, yet essential. energy, infrastructure, the hidden veins of civilization that determine how people live, move, and obey. You imagine standing above a city at night, watching lights flicker on in careful patterns, roads stretch like arteries, water flows unseen, power travels silently through wires and pipes. None of this feels spontaneous. It feels designed. And you ask yourself, gently, who first imagined the city as a machine? Modern governments speak often of infrastructure as investment, development, and progress. But infrastructure also organizes behavior. It directs movement. It limits options. It creates dependence. And once built, it shapes generations without needing constant enforcement. If Tartaria was a civilization of continuity, then its greatest strength may have been mastery of infrastructure, not just roads and bridges, but systems of energy and distribution that made centralized control effortless. Control through convenience rather than force. You are not told of fantastical machines or impossible devices, only of efficiency, of planning at a scale that feels ambitious even today. Straight roads that ignore terrain, cities aligned with geometry rather than chance, buildings positioned with strange consistency, as if following a grid laid out long before modern surveying tools. You think of how modern capitals often sit atop older networks, sewers beneath sewers, foundations beneath foundations. Engineers routinely discover forgotten tunnels, sealed chambers, unused conduits. History calls them obsolete, but obsolete does not mean accidental. Your breathing slows as you consider how energy systems evolve, from water to steam, from coal to electricity, each transition presented as progress. Yet the central idea remains unchanged. Power flows from a source, through a network, to the population. Those who control the source control the system. Perhaps Tartaria understood this long ago. Perhaps its influence lingers not in secret devices, but in the very logic of centralized distribution. One grid serving many, one hub feeding countless nodes. A model modern governments still rely on, because it works. You notice how infrastructure discourages independence. Cities grow where resources are concentrated. People adapt to systems rather than building their own. This creates stability, but also reliance, not oppression, just quiet dependency. You imagine Tartarian planners designing cities not only for efficiency, but for predictability. Straight lines are easier to monitor. Uniform layouts are easier to manage. Standardized buildings are easier to maintain. None of this requires malice, only foresight. Your thoughts drift to how modern states justify surveillance and control through infrastructure needs. Security of energy, protection of water, maintenance of transport. Control becomes a service. Authority becomes invisible, and you feel strangely at peace with this idea. Infrastructure does not threaten, it supports. It makes life easier, and that is why it is trusted. Perhaps Tartaria's greatest lesson was that true governance does not shout commands. It builds systems people rely on so deeply they never question them. As the city lights blur in your imagination, you feel the hum soften, roads fade, wires dissolve, but the pattern remains. Flow, distribution, centralization. And as you drift toward rest, one final thought settles gently beside you. If power flows through infrastructure more than through laws, then who truly governs? The officials we see, or the systems we cannot live without? You continue as though walking deeper into a familiar dream. The idea of infrastructure gently reshapes itself into geography, places, capitals, centers of decision. You notice how power gathers in certain locations again and again, as if drawn by something older than politics. You imagine arriving at a modern capital city. It feels intentional, planned, ceremonial, wide avenues leading toward imposing buildings, monuments aligned with careful precision. And you begin to wonder, why do so many capitals feel as though they were placed, not grown? History tells you that capitals are chosen for strategic reasons. Trade routes, rivers, defensibility, all true. And yet, many capitals seem to sit atop layers of earlier importance. Ancient settlements, sacred grounds, older administrative hubs. as if power prefers familiar ground. If Tartaria was once a unified system, then its seats of governance would have been positioned deliberately, not randomly, but according to geography, energy, and control. When that system fragmented, the locations would remain valuable. Why build a new center when an old one already works? You think of how conquering powers often keep existing capitals. They rename them, rebrand them, but they do not move them. Because capitals are more than buildings. They are nodes in a network. Disrupting them risks destabilizing everything connected to them. Your thoughts slow as you picture a map dotted with capitals across the world. Patterns begin to emerge. Similar distances, similar alignments, similar relationships to rivers, coasts, and trade corridors. Coincidence, perhaps, or the echo of an older planning logic. You imagine Tartarian administrators selecting sites centuries ago, unaware of the flags that would one day fly there. They did not design for nations, but for function. Future rulers simply inherited these positions, mistaking longevity for destiny. You feel a calm realization take hold. Power likes familiarity. It settles where it has settled before. Modern governments may believe they chose their capitals freely, yet their choices may have been guided by invisible hands of history. You think of how citizens travel to capitals for legitimacy. Courts, ministries, embassies, all converging in one place. This centralization feels natural, inevitable, but perhaps it is learned behavior, passed down through centuries of governance. As your breathing deepens, you imagine standing at the center of such a city at night. The streets are quiet, the buildings loom. You sense layers of decision stacked upon one another. Different eras, different rulers, same location, same function. The idea is soothing. It suggests continuity rather than chaos. That even as stories change, the structure remains. Tartaria, if it existed as imagined, may have designed the skeleton upon which modern capitals still rest. You do not need to know which city, which year, which proof. The pattern itself is enough for tonight. Power returns to the same places because those places were chosen long ago, with patience rather than urgency. As the image softens and fades, one final question drifts gently through your thoughts. If capitals are built on previous thrones, then how much of modern authority is truly new, and how much is simply inherited ground, remembering its purpose? You move forward as if turning a page that was always meant to be turned. The cities fade, the capitals grow quiet, and now you find yourself surrounded by words again, but not laws this time. Stories, timelines, textbooks, carefully arranged memories. You begin to feel how history itself is shaped. You think of how confidently history is taught. Dates are firm, causes are clean, effects follow neatly. It feels settled, complete. And yet, you notice how often complexity is softened, how contradictions are smoothed away. You ask yourself gently, who decides which version of the past feels comfortable enough to remember? This is where the idea of the great historical editing settles in, not as deception shouted aloud, but as selection, inclusion here, omission there, a paragraph shortened, a chapter removed. Over generations, the result feels natural, unquestionable. You imagine archivists after a major reset. Fires have burned, records are scattered, decisions must be made quickly. What is essential? What is confusing? What no longer serves the new order? History becomes practical. Not everything can be saved. If Tartaria once existed as a vast organizing system, then its story would be inconvenient, too large, too unifying, too disruptive to narratives of national birth and heroic struggle. Easier to fragment it into regional myths, then let the name dissolve entirely. You think of how children are taught history like a bedtime story. Clear beginnings, clear endings, villains and heroes. This makes the past soothing, understandable, but reality is rarely so neat. Reality overlaps, continues, refuses to reset cleanly. Your breathing slows as you realize how often history is rewritten not by lies, but by emphasis. A revolution is framed as liberation, not succession. A collapse is framed as failure, not transition. Language guides emotion, and emotion shapes belief. You consider how modern governments rely on legitimacy rooted in narrative. If the story says, "We began here," then authority feels earned. But if the story suggested inheritance from a forgotten global system, authority would feel borrowed, fragile. So, the story is edited, not erased entirely, but shortened until it fits the frame. You imagine Tartaria becoming a footnote, then a curiosity, then a joke. Once dismissed, it no longer threatens the narrative. What is ridiculed does not need to be argued against. You feel no anger toward this process, only understanding. Large populations need simple stories. Complexity breeds doubt. Doubt disrupts order. And order, as you have felt throughout this journey, is the quiet priority of every governing system. As your thoughts soften, you realize that history may not be a record of what happened, but of what was allowed to remain visible. What survives is not always what mattered most, but what was easiest to carry forward. You imagine layers of truth sleeping beneath edited timelines, waiting patiently, not demanding belief, only offering themselves to those willing to notice gaps, silences, inconsistencies. And as the words on the page begin to blur, one gentle question rests beside you, like a bookmark left intentionally. If history is edited for stability, then what parts of the past are still waiting quietly between the lines? You drift onward, and the pages of history grow quieter still, as if the ink itself has begun to fade. Now, instead of stories or structures, you sense people, families, names repeated softly across centuries, bloodlines that do not announce themselves loudly, yet never quite disappear. You think of how often leadership seems to run in families, even in systems that claim to reject inheritance. Presidents whose fathers were senators, prime ministers descended from ministers, advisors whose surnames appear again and again in the margins of power. And you ask yourself, calmly, is this coincidence or continuity? Royal bloodlines are easy to recognize. Crowns make inheritance visible. But when crowns fall, blood does not vanish. It adapts. It learns to move quietly, trading titles for influence, thrones for boards, divine right for credentials. If Tartaria was a civilization of long duration, then its ruling families would have understood something essential. Power is safest when it becomes invisible. When authority is dispersed through marriages, alliances, trusts, and education, rather than concentrated in a single throne that can be toppled. You imagine Tartarian elites preparing not for one generation but for many, teaching their children languages, law, administration, placing them not only in courts, but in schools, councils, and religious institutions. Over time, the name Tartaria fades, but the families remain woven into the fabric of governance. Your thoughts slow as you consider how modern governments often rely on experienced families, dynasties without crowns, lineages that understand procedure instinctively because it was taught at the dinner table. This is not conspiracy. It is habit. Power recognizes familiarity. You feel a strange calm in this idea. Bloodlines are not villains or saviors. They are vessels of memory. They carry lessons forward, whether they intend to or not. And in times of collapse, those who remember how systems work are invited back into relevance. You imagine a reset moment. Flags change, ideologies shift, and quietly, certain families are consulted, not because of birthright, but because of continuity, because they know where the levers are hidden. As your breathing deepens, you realize that modern meritocracy and ancient lineage often intertwine. Education replaces coronation, influence replaces decree, yet the effect is similar, stability through familiarity. Perhaps Tartaria's influence survives most clearly here, not in monuments, but in inheritance of understanding. Who to speak to, how to navigate institutions, when to wait, when to act. You feel no accusation in this thought, only acceptance. Humanity has always trusted those who seem prepared, and preparation is often generational. As the image of faces and names gently dissolves, one final question rests softly in your mind. If bloodlines carry memory better than books, then how much of modern leadership is guided by lessons learned long before the nations themselves were named? You move onward as if floating, and the faces and names fade into something colder, quieter, more abstract. Numbers, ledgers, promises written in ink rather than blood. You feel the presence of systems that measure, record, and bind. Finance, the silent language of obligation. You think of how modern governments speak endlessly about money, yet rarely explain its nature. Taxes, debt, interest, these are treated as facts of life, like gravity. But you wonder, gently, when did authority become inseparable from accounting? If Tartaria was a civilization of scale, then it could not have relied on tribute alone. Tribute is personal, emotional, unstable. A vast system requires something calmer, something repeatable, a method of extracting value that feels routine, inevitable, even fair. This is where finance becomes governance. You imagine early administrators replacing conquest with calculation. Instead of force, they use obligation. Instead of fear, they use records. A population that owes is easier to manage than one that resists. Not because it is weak, but because it is entangled. Your thoughts slow as you notice how modern taxation mirrors ancient tribute, yet feels more sophisticated, regular, predictable, framed as contribution rather than submission. The language has softened, but the function remains. Resources flow upward to sustain centralized order. You consider debt, that strange promise that binds future labor to past decisions. Entire nations carry it. Generations are born into it, and no one quite remembers when it began. Debt does not need armies. It governs quietly, patiently, through time. Perhaps Tartaria understood this deeply, that the most durable control is not enforced in the present, but scheduled into the future. Interest accumulates, obligations compound, systems outlive rulers. You feel a calm settle in. This is not evil, it is elegant. Finance abstracts power away from individuals and embeds it into process. Numbers do not argue. Ledgers do not revolt. They simply wait. You imagine ancient financial tools evolving slowly into modern institutions. Treasuries, banks, central authorities that claim neutrality while shaping everything beneath them. They do not rule directly. They enable rule. As your breathing deepens, you notice how modern citizens often understand little about these systems, yet depend on them completely. This dependence feels normal, natural, but perhaps it was learned long ago. You imagine Tartarian planners designing systems of value exchange not for profit, but for stability. Systems so effective that later governments adopted them without question, mistaking inheritance for invention. As the numbers blur and soften, one final thought rests gently in your mind, like a coin placed on closed eyes. If financial systems outlast kings and governments alike, then whose design are we still living inside every time we pay, owe, or comply? You drift onward, and the numbers fade into something softer, warmer, yet just as powerful. Belief, meaning, the quiet stories people tell themselves about why authority exists at all. Religion, philosophy, morality woven gently into governance until the two become difficult to separate. You think of how modern states often claim to be secular, rational, detached from belief, and yet they rely deeply on shared values, sacred principles, unspoken rules of right and wrong. Laws are justified not only by logic, but by moral language, justice, duty, order. You wonder quietly, where did these shared meanings first come from? If Tartaria was a civilization of scale, it would have needed something stronger than force to hold people together. Belief does what armies cannot. It convinces people to cooperate even when no one is watching. It transforms obedience into virtue. You imagine ancient systems where governance and belief were not separate realms, but reflections of one another. Authority framed as natural, hierarchy presented as cosmic, order mirrored in heaven and earth alike. When people believe the system reflects the universe itself, resistance feels pointless. Your thoughts slow as you notice how modern governments still borrow this structure. Constitutions treated with reverence, founding documents displayed like relics, national values spoken of with near religious devotion. Even skepticism has boundaries. You are not told that Tartaria was a theocracy, only that it may have understood how belief stabilizes power. That separating religion from state does not remove belief, it simply relocates it. Faith in gods becomes faith in systems. Trust shifts from priests to institutions. You imagine Tartarian influence surviving here most quietly, not in doctrine, but in framing. Authority presented as moral necessity, governance as stewardship rather than control, compliance as responsibility. You feel a gentle calm in this realization. Humans seek meaning as much as order, and systems that provide both endure. As your breathing deepens, you sense that modern governments may still rest upon invisible belief structures inherited from long ago. Structures so familiar they no longer feel like belief at all. And as the thought settles, one final question drifts softly through your mind. If belief is the softest form of control, then what ancient stories are we still living by, without ever naming them? You continue, unhurried, and the warmth of belief slowly gives way to something colder again. Movement, collision, war, not the chaos you see in movies, but the organized violence that reshapes borders and justifies authority. You feel how conflict enters the story not as interruption, but as mechanism. You have been taught that wars are fought for freedom, resources, survival, ideology, and often they are. But tonight, you allow another possibility to rest beside those explanations. You wonder softly, what if some wars are less about destruction and more about consolidation? You imagine a world after a silent reset. Systems remain, but are fragmented. Authority is scattered. Competing powers emerge, each claiming legitimacy. In such a world, conflict becomes a way to simplify, to reduce many structures into fewer ones, to centralize control under the language of necessity. If Tartaria once existed as a unified order, then its dissolution would have created competing heirs. Smaller states, inheriting fragments of a larger system. Over time, wars between them would not be random, but corrective. A slow process of recombining pieces, trimming excess, restoring balance under new names. Your thoughts slow as you notice how wars often end with treaties. Not annihilation, borders redrawn, institutions merged, debts reassigned, legal systems harmonized. The rhetoric speaks of victory, but the result is administration. You think of how modern wars frequently strengthen central governments. Emergency powers expand, bureaucracies grow, surveillance increases. Populations accept consolidation in exchange for security. This pattern repeats so often that it feels almost natural. You are not asked to see war as planned cruelty, only as a tool that systems use when softer methods fail, when belief weakens, when fragmentation threatens stability. You imagine Tartarian administrators understanding this long ago. That force, when used sparingly and decisively, could restore order more efficiently than endless negotiation. That war, framed correctly, could appear tragic while serving continuity. Your breathing deepens as you accept the idea without judgment. Humanity has always reorganized itself through conflict. What changes is not the function, but the story told afterward. You feel the lullaby rhythm return. March, clash, silence, rebuild. Each war closes with promises of never again, yet the structure remains ready, waiting. And as the sound of imagined battles fades into quiet, one final question rests gently in your mind. If wars often leave systems stronger than before, then were they endings at all, or simply moments of painful alignment? You move onward, and the echoes of conflict soften into distance, like thunder rolling away across the horizon. What remains is motion again, but not armies this time. Ships, caravans, borders stretching outward. You feel the slow expansion that history names colonialism, and tonight you allow yourself to look at it from a different angle. You have been taught that colonialism was discovery, greed, exploitation, ambition, and much of that is true. But you rest with another thought, quieter, less accusatory. You wonder gently, what if some expansion was not about claiming the new, but about reclaiming the old? If Tartaria once spanned vast territories, then its fragmentation would have left familiar lands suddenly labelled as foreign. Over generations, memory would fade. Maps would change, yet systems would still recognize patterns, routes, resources, strategic positions. When emerging empires expanded, perhaps they were not entering the unknown, but stepping back into half-remembered frameworks. You imagine explorers guided by maps that were not entirely new, routes that felt strangely efficient, settlements established in places that already seemed prepared for them, grids appearing where wilderness was expected, as if someone had been there before. Your thoughts slow as you consider how colonial powers often described lands as empty, undeveloped, unused, language that justifies occupation. But emptiness can also mean absence of visible authority, not absence of history. You are not told that colonialism was benevolent, only that its structure may have followed older lines of control, that administrators recognized familiar shapes in distant lands, harbors that functioned like others, cities that grew along predictable axes, populations that fit into known categories of governance. You feel a calm curiosity as you imagine Tartarian influence, surviving through recognition rather than memory. A sense of this works, guiding decisions without explanation. Colonies organized with systems already tested elsewhere. Laws, taxes, education, imposed not randomly but methodically. As your breathing deepens, you realize how often colonialism replaced local complexity with standardized administration. Diversity simplified into manageable forms. This echoes everything you have sensed before. Fragmentation followed by consolidation. Chaos followed by order. You do not excuse suffering in this thought. You simply notice the pattern. Power expands not only to dominate, but to restore systems it understands. Colonialism, then, may have been framed as conquest while functioning as recovery of control. As the image of ships and borders fades, one final question drifts softly through your mind. If expansion often follows forgotten maps, then how much of what we call empire was really a return to something once known? You drift onward, and the wide motions of empires slowly settle into something gentler, more familiar. The noise of conquest fades, replaced by voices speaking of rights, votes, representation, democracy, a word that feels young, hopeful, almost fragile. And yet, tonight, you allow yourself to look beneath its surface. You have been taught that democracy was a break from the past, a clean rejection of kings, empires, inherited rule, power returned to the people, a new beginning. But you ask yourself softly, if democracy replaced ancient systems, why does it still feel structured so carefully, so narrowly, so managed? You notice how modern democracies rely on layers, representatives instead of direct voice, institutions instead of crowds, procedures instead of spontaneity. The language is popular, but the mechanics are precise, almost ceremonial, as if designed not for chaos, but for containment. If Tartaria was a civilization that understood scale, then it would have known the danger of pure openness. Millions of voices cannot govern themselves without structure. Democracy, then, may not be rebellion against ancient order, but its adaptation, a new mask for an old skeleton. Your thoughts slow as you realize how much of democratic governance resembles older councils, assemblies, and advisory bodies. Voting channels opinion, but decision-making remains centralized. The people participate, but within defined boundaries. You are not asked to see democracy as false, only as guided, a system that allows expression while preserving continuity, stability wrapped in the language of freedom. You imagine Tartarian administrators anticipating the need for legitimacy in a changing world, understanding that authority must feel chosen, not imposed. Democracy offers this illusion gently. Power appears to flow upward, even as it remains carefully filtered. Your breathing deepens as you accept this without resistance. Humans need to feel heard. Systems need to endure. Democracy may be the bridge between these needs. You think of how democratic rituals feel ancient. Ballots, chambers, oaths, all echo older traditions. New words, old rhythms. As the idea settles, one final question rests softly in your mind. If democracy still relies on ancient structures, then did power truly change hands, or did it simply learn how to ask politely? You move onward, almost weightless now, and the structures of democracy soften into something subtler still. Screens glow in the dark, devices hum quietly, information flows faster than breath. Technology enters the story not as invention, but as revelation released in measured doses. You have been told that technology advances in leaps, driven by genius, competition, discovery, and perhaps it does. But tonight, you allow another idea to sit beside that belief. You wonder calmly, why does innovation so often feel both sudden and strangely overdue? You notice how certain technologies seem to appear fully formed, systems that integrate instantly into society, tools that reshape behavior almost overnight. They feel less like experiments and more like unlocks, as if something long understood has finally been permitted to surface. If Tartaria was a civilization that valued continuity and control, then it may have understood something essential about knowledge. Release it slowly, or it destabilizes everything. Hold it too tightly, and progress stagnates. The balance lies in timing. Your thoughts slow as you consider how modern governments regulate technology carefully. Patents, clearances, classifications. Some ideas remain hidden for decades before emerging as breakthroughs. Others are quietly shelved, not because they do not work, but because they do not fit the moment. You imagine Tartarian influence surviving here as restraint rather than secrecy, a philosophy of gradual revelation, systems introduced only when society is prepared to absorb them without collapsing. You feel a calm acceptance of this idea. Technology is not neutral. It rearranges power. Those who release it control the pace of change. As the glow of imagined screens fades, one final question rests gently in your mind. If progress arrives only when allowed, then who decides when humanity is ready to know more? You drift onward, slower now, as if the journey itself is beginning to loosen its grip. The glow of technology dims, and what remains is something far more intimate. You, your choices, your sense of freedom, the quiet feeling that you are in control of your own life. And you wonder, gently, what does freedom truly mean inside a system this old? You have been told that you are freer than any generation before you. More options, more information, more voice. And in many ways, this is true. Yet freedom today feels carefully framed. You may choose, but only from available paths. You may speak, but within acceptable boundaries. You may question, but rarely the structure itself. You notice how modern life is organized to feel voluntary. Participation appears optional, yet opting out is difficult. Systems are designed to be indispensable. To leave them is not forbidden, but impractical. This is not tyranny. It is something quieter, something more patient. If Tartaria's influence still lingers, perhaps this is where it rests most deeply, in the understanding that the most stable control does not feel like control at all. It feels like normal life. Your thoughts slow as you consider how rules are now internalized. You follow schedules, deadlines, expectations without being watched. Authority has moved inward. External enforcement becomes unnecessary when habits do the work. You feel no panic in this realization, only clarity. Freedom may not mean absence of structure, but the ability to move within it with awareness. You imagine generations before you navigating similar systems under different names. The structure adapts, but the human experience remains familiar. Responsibility, obligation, choice constrained by context. As your breathing deepens, one final question settles softly beside you. If freedom exists within invisible boundaries, then is it something granted by systems, or something you quietly reclaim by understanding them? You arrive without fanfare. No gates, no revelation. Just a quiet clearing where all the ideas you have carried begin to rest. Tartaria no longer feels like a place you must locate on a map. It feels more like a question that has been walking beside you the entire time. You look back gently, at systems that outlast rulers, at buildings that remember authority, at laws that echo older language, at symbols, bloodlines, infrastructure, belief, war, finance, democracy, technology. None of them shouted their origins. They did not need to. They simply worked. And now you stand at the edge of knowing, where certainty loosens its grip. You realize that the story of Tartaria may never be fully proven or fully dismissed, and perhaps that is the point. It exists in the spaces between official history and lived experience, in patterns rather than proclamations, in continuity rather than collapse. You sense that modern governments do not need to consciously serve an ancient empire to reflect its influence. Inheritance does not require awareness. A child speaks a language before knowing its grammar. A society operates systems before understanding their origins. You feel calm with this uncertainty. The world does not suddenly feel darker or more controlled. If anything, it feels older, more patient, less chaotic than it sometimes appears. You understand now that forgetting may have been intentional, but not malicious. Complexity was simplified so life could continue. Large truths were broken into smaller stories so people could sleep at night. And tonight, you are allowed to sleep too. You do not need to decide what Tartaria was, only to accept that history is deeper than it is presented, and power is quieter than it appears. Whether you believe this story or not is up to you. The thinking was the point. You let the question remain unanswered, because unanswered questions do not disturb rest. They soften it. Now the pace slows even more. Your breathing becomes steady, unforced. The images fade into warmth. Cities dissolve into darkness. Maps fold themselves closed. Systems hum quietly in the background, no longer demanding attention. You are safe here, in this moment between curiosity and rest. The world continues as it always has, guided by structures older than memory, yet softened by human presence. You are not small within it. You are simply part of a long story, walking briefly through its pages. Whatever Tartaria was, whatever still echoes from it, it does not need you to solve it tonight. Understanding is not required for peace. Awareness is enough. Thoughts loosen, muscles relax. The questions drift further away, like lanterns floating out over calm water, their light growing dimmer, softer, kinder. And as sleep approaches, you carry only this gentle truth with you. You are allowed not to know. You are allowed to wonder, and you are allowed to rest.